the first whisper of horror. The autumn of 1891 settled over Pennsylvania like a damp shroud. The air carried the sour tang of coal smoke, the chimneys of Millerville coughing black into a sky that never seemed to clear. Streets turned to sludge beneath the wheels of wagons, and the gas lamps that lined the cobblestones burned pale through the fog, as if reluctant to illuminate what lay beneath. It was on one of these nights, when the town seemed to be holding its breath, that Millerville's most terrible secret began to claw its way into the open. The scene of discovery. The old opera house had been boarded for years, its once grand facade now sagging, windows blind with grime, roof shingles curling, like the pages of a book left too long in the rain. Children dared each other to throw stones at its darkened glass, and drunks stumbled past muttering that the place watched you when your back was turned. Yet on the evening of October 24th, lantern light flickered in the cracks of its foundation. Local authorities, led by 2 reluctant deputies and accompanied by a handful of townsfolk, pried open the basement doors. A stench hit them before they ever set foot inside, something worse than rot, worse than decay. It was the smell of lives starved of light and air. What they found in that basement would never appear in the official records of Millerville. 17 human beings, gaunt, skeletal, and chained to the walls like discarded livestock, blinked against the glow of lanterns. Their eyes, huge and glassy, darted toward the men entering, not with hope, but with an animal kind of terror, as though rescue itself were just another cruel trick. Their wrists were swollen, raw where iron cuffs had eaten into flesh. Some whimpered, some hissed. One began to sing, barely more than a whisper, her voice broken but eerily melodic, like the last breath of a hymn. What chilled the deputies most wasn't just that the captives were alive. It was that they shouldn't have been. Each had been, declared dead, buried, mourned, forgotten. Their names appeared on death certificates filed months, sometimes years earlier. 17 ghosts in chains. The sheriff ordered silence. He swore everyone in that basement to secrecy on pain of imprisonment. Then, just as quickly as the doors had been opened, they were shut again. Millerville, a town of silence. To understand how such horror could hide in plain sight, you have to understand Millerville itself. Nestled between the rolling Pennsylvania hills, the town was equal parts pastoral charm and industrial ugliness. On the outskirts, German farming families still worked the land as their ancestors had, with horse-drawn plows and hand-built barns. In the center, though, the mines ruled everything. Coal dust coated windowsills and clung to the throats of children. Men emerged from the shafts coughing black, their wages barely enough to feed the families waiting for them at home. Millerville had nearly 8,000 souls, most of them recent arrivals, Irish widows chasing factory work, Polish families fleeing poverty, Bavarian laborers drawn by railroad promises. People kept their heads down, their tongues quiet. In a place like this, a man's past mattered far less than whether he paid his debts. And that silence, that deliberate refusal to see what festered in shadow, was the oxygen Cornelius Vaneir breathed. The man behind the curtain Vaneir appeared, in Millerville 4 years earlier, stepping off the Pennsylvania Railroad with 2 things, money and charisma. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the commanding air of someone accustomed to obedience. His dark mustache was waxed into sharp points, his coats were of a finer cut than anything found in local shops, and he tipped silver into every bartender's hand. He claimed Dutch lineage, whispered of New York fortunes, but no one ever bothered to check. Why would they? His money was real, and he spent it freely. Within months, he had purchased the abandoned opera house, a crumbling relic of Millerville's brief flirtation with high culture, and announced it would serve as winter quarters for his traveling circus, Vaneir's Cabinet of Wonders. At first, no one asked what business a circus had with a basement full of chains. The Cabinet of Wonders, by the late 19th century, circuses were the lifeblood of American entertainment. Acrobats flew, strongmen bent steel, elephants paraded under striped tents. But the freak show, the freak show was the true engine of profit. For a dime, a crowd could gawk at bodies that bent the rules of nature, marvel at deformities that blurred the line between human and monster. And Vaneir's freak show was better than any other. There was Eliza, the bone serpent woman, whose body could twist and coil until her ribs seemed to vanish. There was Johann, the Bavarian colossus, a towering giant who bent iron bars like twigs. And the darling of the troupe, little Mary Catherine, the singing angel, a girl with no arms, but a voice that rang pure as cathedral bells. Audiences gasped, fainted, applauded. Vaneir's name spread across counties, whispered in taverns and children's bedtime tales. He was hailed as a genius, a showman without equal. But the townspeople never wondered why his performers never seemed to age. Why no one ever saw them outside the show. Why some looked hauntingly familiar, like faces from missing persons posters that had long since yellowed. Seeds of unease. Not everyone was blind. A handful of families whispered that their sons and daughters had disappeared after the circus passed, through nearby towns. Mothers swore they'd seen their children on stage, dressed in costumes under new names, but Sheriff Josiah Cromwell, a thick-necked man with a permanent scowl, laughed them out of his office. Missing persons were common in mining towns, he said. Accidents happened. People moved on. What those grieving families didn't know was that Cromwell's pockets jingled with Vaneir silver every month. $50, more than 2 months' wages for a miner, bought silence, bought blindness, bought the freedom for horror to fester. Beside Cromwell stood another ally, Dr. Heinrich Kellerman. Supposedly a German physician, Kellerman rented an office above the general store and quickly attached himself to Vaneir's enterprise. He called himself a specialist in human anomalies, and the people of Millerville believed him. But his true specialty was chemistry, the preparation of drugs that dulled the mind, slowed the body, and made obedience not just expected, but inevitable. The three men together, Vaneir, Cromwell, Kellerman, built a machine of exploitation, so polished that it thrived unnoticed for a decade. Until one night a crack formed. The first escape it began not with a grand police raid or an intrepid journalist, but with a mistake. A miscalculation in Kellerman's careful dosing. A girl stumbled, barefoot into the office of the Millerville Gazette, her clothes in tatters, her skin bruised, her hair matted. She looked no older than 20, though starvation had carved her down to bone. Her name, though she seemed unsure of it at first, was Sarah Henley. "They're still down there," she whispered to Thomas Fairchild, the editor working late, at his desk. Her lips trembled, her hands clawed at his sleeve. "In the dark. They can't get out. The chains are too heavy." Fairchild tried to soothe her, but her words spilled out in jagged fragments. Needles and bitter medicine. Endless. Rehearsals until muscles tore. Men who told her she was already dead. She spoke of the opera house basement with uncanny accuracy, of a ledger that listed names not as people, but as investments. And then she said the words that froze Fairchild's blood. "They showed me my death certificate." Millerville was a town built on silence, but Sarah Henley's voice had broken it. Her story carried the weight of something more than madness. It carried details too precise, horrors too intimate. For Fairchild, a journalist in a town that rarely produced more than news of coal shipments and church picnics, this was either the greatest story of his career or the last he would ever write. And so begins the unraveling of Cornelius Vaneir's Cabinet of Wonders, with one terrified girl and a single whispered truth. The dead were not dead at all. The Cabinet of Wonders, the town of Millerville had long grown used to swallowing whispers whole. Coal dust filled their lungs, and silence filled their nights. But after Sarah Henley's desperate arrival at the Gazette office, one man, journalist, Thomas Fairchild, found himself pulled into a current too dark to escape. Sarah's words were broken, fragmented like glass shards, but each piece glittered with truth too sharp to ignore. "They tell us we're already gone," she whispered, staring into the corner of Fairchild's office as though someone, or something still lingered there. They show us papers, my name was on it, Sarah Henley, date of death, cause of death, but I was there. Breathing. Fairchild's pen hovered over his notebook, hand trembling. He'd seen plenty of hysteria in coal towns before. Grief-stricken. Widows, delirious miners coughing black phlegm. But this was different. Sarah's details were too exact, too architectural. She described the basement corridors of the opera house with the precision of someone who had lived them. The image she painted was less a performance hall than a warren of suffering. The hidden world below. Beneath the opera house, Sarah said. Each captive was kept in a cell barely wide enough to stretch their arms. Heavy chains secured wrists and ankles, just enough slack to shuffle, never enough to reach the door. Buckets of water and waste. No windows, no clocks. Time dissolved in the dark. They were made to practice endlessly, not only to perform their acts, but to become them. If one faltered, Kellerman had his syringes. Bitter medicine, Sarah called it. It blurred thought, erased willpower, left a fog behind the eyes. The more they resisted, the higher the doses, and then there was the ledger. Mr. Vaneir keeps it in his office, Sarah muttered, her voice shaking with both fear and fury. All our names, where we came from, what we cost. He calls us his investments. The faces behind the axe Fairchild pressed her gently, coaxing names from the haze of her memory. Johann Brenner, known to audiences as the Bavarian Colossus, had once been a dock worker in Philadelphia. His great crime was being gentle in a body that was anything but. Vaneir broke him with opiates and endless humiliation until the giant forgot the sound of his own name. Catherine Ali, reborn as the singing angel, had been a local celebrity in Scranton. Her armless body and divine voice made her both cherished and exploited. When she vanished after a theatrical audition, her family received a death certificate signed by Dr. Kellerman himself. Eliza Thornton, the bone serpent woman, had been a runaway from Harrisburg. Her talent for contortion was natural, but under Kellerman's injections and Vaneir's command, it became monstrous. Sarah swore Eliza's joints cracked audibly with every twist, yet Vaneir insisted the crowd loved her inhuman grace. Each name, each story, widened Fairchild's horror. These were not volunteers. They were stolen, rewritten, rebranded as curiosities, Millerville's pact of silence. If Sarah's tale was true, and Fairchild's gut screamed that it was, it meant Millerville had been complicit. Sheriff Cromwell's silence was no accident. It was bought. And Kellerman's smiling consultations were nothing more than abductions wrapped in the veneer of medicine. Fairchild thought of the miners he passed daily, their eyes ringed with fatigue, their hands black with soot. Men who never asked questions. Men who couldn't afford to. In a town where every penny went to survival, who would risk it all to challenge a man like Cornelius Vaneir? And Vaneir had played his role perfectly. In public, he was generous, charismatic. He bought rounds at taverns, donated to church repairs, even sponsored holiday feasts. To question him was to question the very man feeding the community. Fairchild understood then. Millerville wasn't blind. It was willfully blind. Seeds of defiance. But Sarah, broken, trembling, half-starved, had cracked the silence. She told Fairchild of her escape, a dosage miscalculated, a nervous assistant named Peter fumbling his routine, a shackle left loose, crawling through filth and darkness, clawing her way through a half-rotted window. She'd run barefoot across the night, streets until she collapsed at the Gazette. Her body had escaped. Her mind, not entirely. She clutched Fairchild's arm, nails digging crescent moons into his skin. They'll come for me. They always come back. Fairchild believed her, but instead of fear, he felt something else. A cold, electric clarity. If Sarah's account was true, this wasn't just a story. It was the story. The kind that could topple men like Vaneir. The kind that could change the course of a town drowning in its own apathy. The decision. That night, Fairchild walked home with his coat collar turned high against the fog, Sarah's voice echoing in his ears. Chains too heavy. Papers that said she was dead. A ledger that turned lives into investments. He knew two things with certainty. Sheriff Cromwell was compromised. Going to him would be suicide. To expose Vaneir, he would need more than words. He would need proof. Photographs, documents, testimonies. Enough evidence that even the most corrupt judge couldn't bury it. And that meant stepping into the belly of the beast itself, the basement of the Millerville Opera House. Fairchild paused, outside his home, staring at the faint glow of his lantern through the frosted window. His wife and daughter slept inside, blissfully unaware. He clenched his jaw. Whatever waited in that basement could cost him everything. But Sarah had placed her trust in him. And somewhere, 17 souls still rattled their chains, waiting for someone to listen. He would not fail them. Across town, in a second-floor office above the general store, Dr. Kellerman adjusted his spectacles and frowned at his inventory ledger. A vial of laudanum gone, a bottle of chloroform light by 2 ounces. His lips curled in suspicion. Somewhere something was amiss. The Cabinet of Wonders was about to feel its first tremor. The descent, October 24th, 1891. The fog clung to Millerville streets like a veil of gauze, muffling every sound. Horses whinnied nervously in their stables, and even the gas lamps flickered low, as though they knew what the night was about to reveal. Thomas Fairchild stood in the alley beside the opera house, lantern shielded, camera case slung over his shoulder. Beside him, Sarah Henley trembled barefoot on the cobblestones, her eyes darting like a hunted animal's. She had already risked everything by escaping once. Now she was walking willingly back into the jaws of hell. "Are you certain?" Fairchild whispered. "They don't sleep down there," Sarah answered, her voice barely audible. "But this hour is when Kellerman visits the social club with the others. If we move quickly—" Her hand brushed the scar around her wrist, a pale groove, left by iron shackles. It's the only chance. The descent begins. The basement window she had wriggled through weeks before was still unlatched. Fairchild squeezed himself through first, boots sinking into the cold earth. The air hit him like a physical blow, a blend of damp stone, urine, and something sweet and cloying that burned the back of his throat. Sarah followed, landing silently beside him. Her eyes adjusted instantly to the dark. She knew these corridors like the lines carved into her hands. The lantern's flame was shaded, throwing a cone of weak light. It revealed walls slick with moisture, corridors narrowing into oppressive black. Every creak of chain, every shuffle of unseen bodies seemed amplified by the silence. And then he saw them. Faces in the dark. The first cell contained what had once been a man. His eyes stared blindly at the ceiling, mouth slack with drool. Shackles bit so deeply into his wrists that bone gleamed through. Fairchild's hand shook as he raised the camera, the click of the shutter sounding obscene in the silence. Further down, he found Johann. The Bavarian colossus was hardly the giant of stage legend. His body, wasted by hunger, seemed too large for the cell, too fragile for the chains that bound him. Yet when Sarah whispered his real name, Johann Brenner, the giant's eyes flickered. Recognition. Hope. Then the light guttered, replaced by the dull stare of a broken mind. Catherine Ali, the singing angel, sat crumpled in another cell. Her once golden voice rasped now as nothing but air scratching against scarred vocal cords. She tried to hum, just for Sarah, but the sound was a hollow echo of memory. Tears streaked through the dirt on her face. Each cell was worse than the last. The Cabinet of Wonders wasn't a family of performers. It was a mausoleum of the living. The ledger of the damned Sarah guided Fairchild to Vaneir's office, a small chamber once meant to sell tickets. Behind a warped wooden panel, she pulled free a ledger. Fairchild opened it with hands he could barely control. Inside, in Vaneir's bold script, were names, 43 of them. Real names, stage names, dates, prices. Beside many, the word discontinued. He photographed each page feverishly, his lantern shaking. These weren't performers. They were inventory. Sarah gripped his arm. This is what I told you. This is how he keeps us, like cattle. Fairchild wanted to speak, but words failed. His only answer was the click of the camera, preserving damnation on glass plates. The laboratory. They nearly turned back before they saw it. A side room, once the opera house's wine cellar, had been converted into something far more grotesque. Tables lined with glass vials and needles, surgical instruments dulled by overuse, and notes scrawled in both German and English. Fairchild skimmed one page, his stomach turning. Subject resists. Increased dosage. Identity erasure proceeding. New designation. Serpent woman. It wasn't just captivity. It was a deliberate dismantling of the human mind and body. Sarah's hands shook as she traced the edge of a scalpel. He told us we had no past, no future, only the cabinet. I thought it was true. Her voice cracked. God help me. Sometimes I believed him. The trap springs. The air grew heavier. Fairchild noticed it first, the faint, sweet tang intensifying. His head swam, knees softening. Sarah staggered. No, not again. The lantern flickered. Shadows danced. From above, the slow groan of floorboards. Heavy boots descending. Voices low and certain. Fairchild's camera slipped in his grip as dizziness washed over him. He pressed a hand to the wall, realizing too late what the sweetness meant. Chloroform. Pumped through the vents. Sarah collapsed beside him, her fingers twitching against the stone. Chains rattled as the captive stirred, moaning in confused terror. Fairchild forced his eyes open long enough to see a shape emerging from the stairwell. Tall, broad, lantern in one hand, revolver in the other. Cornelius Vaneir. His silhouette loomed against the glow like a devil stepping into his cathedral. Sheriff Cromwell and Dr. Kellerman followed close behind, two hired thugs at their heels. The last thing Fairchild saw before the world slid into black was Vaneir's smile. Cold. Certain. When consciousness returned, the reporter was no longer an intruder. He was a prisoner, shackled in the same chains he had just photographed, listening to Sarah's faint breathing in the neighboring cell. The Cabinet of Wonders had claimed 2 new exhibits. The emergency protocol, when Thomas Fairchild awoke, it was to the cold kiss of iron around his wrists. Chains dragged at his shoulders like a second skeleton, heavy and unyielding. The damp stone wall bit into his back, and the smell of chloroform clung to his clothes, as if he'd been baptized in it. Through the dim haze of lantern light, he saw Sarah in the cell beside his, her body slumped but breathing shallowly. Relief flickered, short-lived. Across from them, the captives moaned softly in their own chains like a choir of broken throats. And then the footsteps came. Interrogation by monsters, Sheriff Cromwell entered first, rolling his shoulders like a man preparing for sport. Behind him, Dr. Kellerman carried a case of instruments that clinked with glass and steel. And then Vaneir, impeccable even in this tomb of filth, strode in with a composure that made the air itself colder. Mr. Fairchild, Vaneir said, his tone smooth as polished mahogany. I admire courage. Foolish courage, perhaps, but still, admirable. You wished for the truth? Now you'll drown in it. Cromwell was crude. His fists did the talking, his revolver butt cracking Fairchild's cheek, his voice thick with mockery. Kellerman was clinical. He pressed needles into flesh, twisted joints to the brink of snapping, murmuring observations in German as though Fairchild were a specimen. But Vaneir was worse. He leaned close, studying Fairchild's face with a scholar's interest. You have presence, Thomas. Intelligent eyes. With the right training, you'd command an audience. I can already see the act, the melancholy gentleman, a man of letters driven mad by forbidden knowledge. Tell me, would you prefer a tragic monologue, or perhaps silent weeping? The crowd does love a silent man forced to scream without sound. Fairchild tried to spit at him, but his mouth was too dry. Vaneir only smiled, breaking the mind days, or hours, Fairchild couldn't tell, bled together in a haze of blows, injections, and whispered threats. Cromwell described in detail what would be done to Sarah if Fairchild failed to cooperate. Kellerman promised the pain could continue indefinitely without leaving scars. The worst was Vaneir's philosophy, delivered in calm, measured tones. Freedom, Mr. Fairchild, is a cruel joke. People yearn for chains, though they pretend otherwise. The Cabinet of Wonders provides purpose. My performers no longer wander as outcasts. They belong. They are admired, feared, immortalized. Do you not see? I have elevated them. He paused, eyes glinting. And soon perhaps you as well. The emergency protocol outside the basement, the conspirators convened. Sarah's escape and Fairchild's intrusion had shaken their confidence. Kellerman's missing chemicals proved someone had sniffed too close. The solution: enact the emergency protocol. It was simple, brutal, and final. Kill the captives with morphine and strychnine. Burn the opera house with kerosene, leaving only ash. Relocate the cabinet to Ohio, where an asylum director awaited their arrival. 17 lives, snuffed like lanterns. 2 more, Fairchild and Sarah, added to the tally. Across the distance, Margaret Dalton Butt in Philadelphia, miles away, a different story unfolded. Margaret Dalton, one of the few women clawing her way into serious journalism, sat at her desk with a stack of Fairchild's letters. At first, they had been quaint musings about small-town life. But gradually the tone had shifted. Missing persons, a charismatic circus master, whispers of corruption. In his final letter, dated just 2 days before Sarah's escape, Fairchild had written plainly, "If anything happens to me, Margaret, remember this name, Cornelius Vaneir. The Cabinet of Wonders is not entertainment. It is imprisonment. If you do not hear from me in 10 days, bring the bureau." Margaret traced the ink with her fingertip, jaw tightening. She had already dispatched inquiries to her contacts in the Treasury Department and the fledgling Bureau of Investigation. She'd copied his letters to colleagues in Pittsburgh and New York. Even if Millerville tried to bury this, the roots of the story had already spread. She whispered to herself, "Hold on, Thomas. Just hold on." Fractures in the machine back in the opera house, a different fracture emerged. Peter, Kellerman's assistant, the nervous young man who had miscalculated Sarah's dose, watched in horror as preparations for the mass poisoning began. His hands shook as he measured vials. His conscience screamed. At last he slipped away under the pretense of fetching more supplies, running through fog-drenched streets to the parsonage of Reverend Samuel Brooks. Breathless, half-mad with fear, Peter spilled the truth. Chains in the basement. 17 captives. Murder planned before dawn. The Reverend stared at him in disbelief, until Peter described Catherine Ali, the armless singer, in vivid detail. The Reverend remembered her face from a concert years earlier, a woman who had been declared dead. It was enough. Brooks sent urgent telegrams to Harrisburg, calling for the state police. In the opera house basement, Fairchild pressed his head against the stone, Sarah's labored breaths filling the silence. He could feel the poison of despair creeping in, the sense that the cabinet would consume him too. Above them, Vaneir lit his cigar with steady hands. "Gentlemen," he said to Cromwell and Kellerman, "tonight we erase our mistakes." But beyond Millerville, telegraph wires hummed, carrying words that would soon bring fire and fury down upon the Cabinet of Wonders. The opera house burns. The night of October 29th began in silence. By dawn, Millerville would awaken to smoke, shattered glass, and the howling of human voices long believed to be dead. The poisoning delayed down in the basement. The captives stirred uneasily as Kellerman prepared his syringes. The doctor's hands were steady, precise, almost reverent. He muttered to himself in German, "Schnell, schnell, and clean exit, no mess." But Peter, his young assistant, could no longer obey. Every time he filled a vial, his stomach clenched tighter. His conscience had gnawed at him for months, but now faced with the quiet certainty of murder. It snapped. "I'll take these to Mr. Vaneir," he lied, gathering the tray of glass. Instead, he fled upstairs, boots pounding the wooden floorboards, heart in his throat. By the time Kellerman realized the vials were missing, Peter was gone, racing through the fog to Reverend Brooks, begging him to summon the state police. Hours ticked away. The poisoning stalled. And in that fragile delay, Fairchild made his move. Fairchild's escape. His chains bit into raw skin, but Fairchild had noticed something Kellerman had not. The anchor bolt in the damp stone was crumbling. Night after night he pressed, twisted, strained. His wrists bled, shoulders screamed. But stone gave way before steel. With a final wrench, the bolt cracked loose. The chain clattered softly against the wall. Fairchild staggered to Sarah's cell first. She looked at him with hollow eyes, but when he whispered, "We're leaving," something flickered, faint but alive. Together they began freeing others. Johann Brenner groaned as the shackles fell from his monstrous wrists. Catherine Ali wept as Sarah touched her shoulder and said, "Sing again. Just once more. For us." Not all could walk. Not all could even understand what was happening. Some were too drugged, too broken, but enough stirred. Enough remembered they were alive. And then Kellerman returned. The confrontation. The doctor froze in the doorway, eyes widening at the sight. Chains broken, captives stumbling free, Fairchild standing unshackled in the lantern glow. He screamed for Vaneir. Heavy boots thundered above. The basement filled with the echo of authority. The sheriff's bark, Vaneir's calm orders, the metallic click of revolvers being primed. The air grew hotter, thicker. Fairchild's head swam with a new smell. Kerosene. Someone upstairs was dousing the opera house. The emergency protocol had begun. Chaos on the stage. What followed was not battle. It was madness. Cromwell descended first, revolver raised. He fired into the stone, bullets sparking, trying to herd the captives back. Sarah shrieked, dragging Catherine behind her. Johann roared, a guttural sound of rage and confusion, and lunged forward with the force of a man who had nothing left to lose. Chains became weapons. Shackles swung like clubs. Weak bodies surged with desperate strength. And above it all, Cornelius Vaneir remained composed, descending the stairs like a conductor entering his orchestra. He raised his lantern high, the flame reflecting in his eyes. "Enough," he commanded, his voice cutting through the screams. "Back to your places. You are mine." But for the first time in years, no one obeyed. Peter's gambit. At the top of the stairs, Peter appeared, pale and trembling. "The police are coming," he shouted. His voice cracked, but the words carried like a gunshot. Vaneir spun on him, eyes blazing. "Traitor." Before he could fire, a crash split the air, the opera house doors bursting open. Reverend Brooks stormed in, 3 state police officers at his side. Their rifles caught the lantern light, and for the first time, Vaneir's calm cracked. Jan Brenner's awakening. And then something no one expected. Johann Brenner, long drugged, long broken, suddenly roared with a clarity that shook the basement. Walls. He had seen Kellerman's face through the iron bars. And in that moment, recognition tore through the fog of chemicals. His enormous hands seized the barricade of furniture Vaneir had stacked near the stairwell. Wood splintered like kindling. With each heave, Johann tore down the wall that had confined them, bellowing like a wounded beast. The captives rallied, dragging each other forward, voices rising in a discordant, terrible hymn. Not harmony, defiance. The fire spreads kerosene. Caught. Flames licked the floorboards. Smoke curled down the stairwell, choking the air. The opera house groaned like a dying animal as timbers cracked in the heat. The last performance of Vaneir's Cabinet of Wonders had begun, and the audience was no longer content to sit in silence. Fairchild dragged Sarah toward the stairs, coughing, his eyes burning. Behind him, Kellerman wailed as Johann ripped the barricade apart. Cromwell shouted orders no one obeyed, and Vaneir, standing amidst smoke and ruin, laughed, a deep, terrible laugh. "Let it burn," he said. "The cabinet will rise again." Above, the rafters cracked. Sparks rained down like falling stars. The opera house was becoming their pyre. The ashes of Millerville. When the smoke finally cleared, Millerville looked like a town waking from a nightmare. The opera house, once the pride of its main street, stood blackened and skeletal. Charred beams jutted into the dawn sky like broken ribs. Inside, the stage had collapsed into the basement, burying iron chains in ash and soot. But the voices that drifted out of that ruin were not ghosts. They were living. Barely, but living. Dawn of the survivors. 17 souls were led blinking into the pale light. Some walked on their own, clutching blankets given by state police. Others had to be carried, bones jutting like scaffolds beneath their skin. Thomas Fairchild stumbled among them, blood crusted on his temple, his notebook clutched like a weapon. Sarah leaned against him, whispering names, real names, to the officers as though speaking them aloud might stitch reality back together. And then, against the rasp of coughing and the crackle of embers, Catherine Ali began to sing. Her voice was ruined, a rasp that scraped more than it soared, but the melody was unmistakable. A hymn her mother had taught her. One by one the others joined, their broken tones weaving into something both ragged and holy. The hymn rose through the smoke, over the cracked bricks, over the town that had chosen blindness for so long. It was not beautiful. It was human. Justice. As spectacle news traveled faster than trains. Within weeks, the trials of Cornelius Vaneir, Sheriff Cromwell, and Dr. Heinrich Kellerman gripped the nation. Newspapers printed every sordid detail. The ledger pages Fairchild had saved became exhibits, read aloud in court like scripture of damnation. Survivors testified through trembling lips. Reporters scribbled furiously, ink bleeding horror onto the page. Vaneir himself was defiant, to the end. In court he stood tall, polished, charming even as the charges mounted. "I gave them purpose," he declared. "I gave them fame. You call it crime, I call it art. But the jury did not call it art. They called it murder. 43 counts of kidnapping, 17 of unlawful imprisonment, 26 of murder." His execution on March 15, 1893, drew crowds as large as any circus he had ever commanded. Some came to jeer, some to pray, some simply to watch the man who had turned people into exhibits finally become a spectacle himself. Kellerman avoided the noose through cooperation. He confessed in meticulous detail, exposing a web of corrupt officials and accomplices across 6 states. His sentence, life imprisonment. Cromwell bargained too, trading names for years. He died in his cell before serving half his term. Lives in fragments for the survivors, freedom was not the end of the story. Sarah Henley returned to Lancaster, where her family had once buried an empty coffin in her name. She became an advocate, her voice trembling but relentless, warning that human beings could vanish into shadows and be written off as discontinued. Johann Brenner, the Bavarian colossus, never fully recovered. His mind, dulled by years of opiates, remained childlike. Yet townsfolk remembered how he had torn down barricades with his bare hands. Some whispered he had been an angel of wrath that night, not a victim. Catherine Ali never regained her voice, but she continued to sing in whispers, each rasping note a defiance against silence. Audiences who once paid to gawk at her now gathered to weep at the sound of what Vaneir had almost stolen. Not all the survivors lived long. Years of abuse, starvation, and drugs claimed several within the decade. But their names lived on in testimony, in ink, in the whispered warnings of towns too frightened to admit how easily they had been complicit. The shadow beyond Millerville historians would later call the Cabinet of Wonders one of America's earliest cases of organized human trafficking. But in the hushed corners of the trial transcripts, something more disturbing surfaced. Kellerman's notes referenced other cabinets, not just Millerville, private exhibitions in Ohio, discreet contacts in New Jersey, an asylum in Illinois, with rooms that locked from the outside. The opera house had burned. Vaneir had swung, but the cabinet was not a single show. It was a network. How many other ledgers existed? How many other names had already been marked discontinued? Curtain call on cold nights, Millerville locals swore they could still hear singing from the blackened skeleton of the opera house, a hymn fractured and haunting carried on the wind. Some said it was Catherine's song. Others whispered it was the cabinet itself, voices chained forever in the town's memory. The opera house is gone now. The fire erased its stone foundations, but stories have longer lives than buildings. And when people speak of Millerville, Pennsylvania in 1891, they speak not of industry or progress, but of chains in the basement, 17 souls, declared dead, yet found alive. A ledger that turned lives into numbers, a town that chose silence, until silence burned. Cornelius Vaneir's cabinet of wonders is gone. But the question remains, how many other cabinets still wait in the dark,